We affirm that the USFG ought to pay reparations to African Americans. Merriam-Webster defines ought as a duty or moral obligation and reparations as the act of making amends for a wrong. If we can prove that the U.S. federal government either has a moral obligation to pay reparations or that reparations will help make amends by benefiting African Americans, you vote pro. Contention 1 is moral obligation. Talpa of the National Coalition of Blacks writes that slavery was protected by the U.S. Constitution, further discriminating by upholding that an African American vote is only worth 3/5 of a white man. Meanwhile, complicity in segregation laws and the direct perpetration of discriminatory housing policies all lead to the logical conclusion that the federal government's past actions against African Americans were unjust. These policies have continuing effects today. Author Hamilton Nolan writes that white households are worth 20 times as much as black households, and the income gap between black and white households is the same today as 1970. When you enslave people, steal their labor, and then oppress them for countless generations, the effects persist over time. Thus, Thomas McCarthy of the Northwestern University writes that if one agent has wrongfully harmed another, then the perpetrator has an obligation to repair, as far as possible, the damage to the victim. The U.S. federal government ought to attempt to repair the situation that they have placed African Americans in. Contention 2 is progress. Reparations will lead to long-term change for 3 reasons. First is acknowledging governmental discrimination. Bird of the Green Lining Institute writes that 84% of non-black Americans believe that racism is not a major issue in the U.S. The Social Watch continues that this indifference creates stereotypes that blame the victims, such as African Americans are lazy or cause crime. Reparations force the government to acknowledge that the disadvantages blacks face are a result of racism caused by the government and society, and not a result of the black race itself. Balfour, the University of Virginia, furthers that acknowledging continual racial injustices will help to generate the political will necessary to attack current problems, because now society knows that African Americans are no longer this lost cause, but rather a group that deserves future advances. Empirically, UMassachusetts Anthony Chen concludes that civil rights mobilization increases the probability that the government passes fair legislation by 3 times. Put simply, we need to acknowledge the problem before we can find a solution. Second is strengthening minority coalitions. Yuhawai's Yamamoto writes that right now, minority coalitions are ineffective because of misunderstandings of historical grievances and a belief that the government is not standing for minority rights. When the reparations are paid, Robinson of GMU posits that the government reaffirms its commitment to the greater civil rights movement, establishing a public perception that coalitions are effective. More generally, Oxford's Jack Levy writes that when the public believes that coalitions can be effective political outlets, they're more likely to join them. That's why Yamamoto empirically writes that after reparations to Japanese Americans, Asian American groups join minority coalitions like the NAACP to push for new progressive reform. Cardiff University's Russell Spears confirms this in a meta-analysis of 182 instances and quantifies that a perception of efficacy within coalitions increases collective political action by 34%. That's critical because CSU's Raphael Heinstein writes that without forging interracial coalitions, individual races will not have enough political power to create long-term change. And third is discourse. McCarthy explains that reparations would ignite discussion that raises public consciousness, improving awareness of the history of discrimination and how it has shaped our institutions and our inequalities. Bacon of the Quarterly Journal of Speech furthers that raising racial issues is the first step in changing racist views. Anyone who encounters such discussion would walk away more educated about racism and see the issue as more complex than they originally thought. Thus, Robinson writes that reparations discourse will help counteract racism in the long term, even if there is short-term backlash. In fact, a psychological study from Srolla of the Journal of Experimental Psychology concludes that discussions about race reduces discriminatory responses in the forms of implicit biases. The alternative is far worse, as Chang of Stanford University argues that decades of racial progress have been erased absent progressive discussion over time. Progress begins with pro, thus we are very proud to affirm.
Cool. Before we speak, may we see the 34% card?
The Spears evidence?
Yeah.
Can we bring that up in like rounds after each round of speeches? I'll show it to you.
Yeah. Okay. Is anyone not ready? Wonderful. I'll begin. Zubin and I negate resolve. The United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. Eric Posner of the University of Chicago defines reparations as payment in cash or kind to correct a past wrong instead of to combat a future or current problem. Contention 1, reparations destroy social movements. Subpoint A, status quo prison reform. Journalist Joseph Urbantrout writes that right now, movements toward prison reform are happening. These movements will be successful because what they cite, Anthony Chen of Michigan, finds that historically, social movements lead to 3 times fairer laws. Reforming our prison system is the most important issue in the round because Professor Michelle Alexander explains the prison system is used to label minorities as criminals in order to make them work without pay in prison. Our second subpoint is that reparations destroy these movements. Professor Richard Epstein writes that reparations will undermine current movements that tackle racism. This is true for 2 reasons. First, reparations allow whites to deny the existence of racism. Paul Street of the Chicago Urban League writes that the call for slavery reparations reinforces the dominant white majority sense that racism is over. This happened in South Africa, where journalist Jeffrey York writes that racism is mounting a comeback and that after reparations, there are now 17% fewer people who actually believe that the apartheid was a crime against humanity. Twen Van Dyke, professor of discourse studies, writes that this denial prevents reform to racial policies, which makes reducing racism impossible. Second is that reparations produce an illusion of progress. Duke sociologist Vanilla Silva writes in 2006 that framing issues of race in the Jim Crow era to assess whites' racial views today misses the injustices going on right now, destroying motivation to fight racism. This happened with Japanese reparations. Yamamoto writes that after reparations, let the government off the hook and decreased motivation to combat racism against Americans. Our second contention is that reparations will lead to political rollback. Bennett Maraskin, former representative of the National Labor Relations Board, writes that 90% of white Americans will have hostility towards reparations. This will lead to the rolling back of affirmative actions that are vital for African Americans in 2 ways, or 3 ways. First, reparations will lead to worse political representation. John McCarran of the Chicago Tribune writes that reparations will trigger resentment that leads to worse political representation in Congress. With the coming election, reparations would decrease black representation in the government and cause voters to elect leaders that roll back hard-won affirmative action programs for blacks. And second, welfare cuts. Hannah Brown from Wake Forest University writes that after racialized policy decisions, politicians must compete for votes from racially resentful voters. The way politicians get these votes is by promising more punitive welfare towards the other racial group. After reparations are passed, politicians would try to win the white resentful vote by passing welfares that hurt African Americans. Third, direct affirmative action rollback. Calvin Massey writes that affirmative action after a reparations scheme would be politically impractical because non-black America is unlikely to accept the premise that it must pay twice for a single wrong. Believing the problem to be already fixed, affirmative action would trade off with reparations. This happened empirically with the Affordable Care Act, which was considered stealth reparations for slavery. The 2 Congresses after the Affordable Care Act were the least productive since 1947. Our third contention is that reparations create harmful stereotypes. When the government frames poverty reduction policies from the perspective of helping only African Americans, it creates terrible stereotypes. Economics professors Peffley and Hurwitz explains that racial stereotypes are much stronger when a government policy is only targeting African Americans. This leads to 3 impacts. First, welfare cuts. Christopher DeSant from Oberlin College explains that when African Americans are portrayed through stereotypes, their welfare is cut by 5.5 times as much as whites. Second, destructive thought. Enola Aird writes that black stereotypes negatively affect black people's sense of self-worth and efficacy, limiting black children's possibilities and contributing to the destructive behaviors in the black community. And third, job discrimination. David Francis explains that when African Americans are subject to stereotypes, they lead to 50% less job offers. Okay. You want to trade cards now?
Oh yeah, let's do it. Can I just see this one piece of evidence about 5.5 times less welfare because of reparations?
Yeah.
Can you just like highlight that?
It's literally it's the only underlying stuff.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. And by the way, it's 182 effects, and he says that injustice 39%, efficacy 34%, coalition efficacy.
Okay.
And we have like all the other options you read for the contention for there.
Sweet. Okay.
Okay. Do we want to?
Yeah.
If we're doing
this
a two-way
while we
exchange,
Here,
we'll
what
just
is
read
two
through
cards? Yeah.
You guys want to exchange your Yeah. All right,
Here, I'll
Alright.
give me those.
Okay. Alright, you want to read?
At the first question,
Go for it.
does justice care about backlash?
Of course.
Why? If a judge is making a decision, does it like take into consideration what the public is going to think?
I'm not really sure I understand the question.
Like, here's the thing, right? Justice doesn't really care about backlash because in the end, if we are justified to do something, we still ought to do it. The backlash that happens after that might hypothetically happen, doesn't really matter.
The problem is that this backlash is going to be not beneficial toward African Americans. We outlined 3 ways that this backlash leads to less programs that actually help African Americans.
Here's the problem, right? We give you empirics of historical examples of Japanese Americans because right after we gave them reparations, they started joining minority coalition groups like the NAACP, and they started pushing for even more reforms. So in the end,
problem is that you're not responding to the what our argument is. When we give reparations 3 different ways, it leads to less affirmative action and actual welfare that helps African Americans.
Sure.
So maybe they join coalitions.
Okay, so how do you guarantee me that affirmative action is actually going to disappear?
Sorry?
How do you guarantee me that affirmative action is
So,
going to disappear? Like,
Tim
you give me
Wise-
these
Tim
3
Wise-
reasons, right?
Tim-
But you
Tim-
can't guarantee me.
We empirically show that Tim Wise writes the Affordable Care Act was seen by people perceived to be a reparation to African Americans, and this led to the least productive Congress since 1947. They passed the least amount of legislation for
thing,
African
right?
Americans.
Does affirmative action affect other minority groups?
Sure.
So how is it a reparation to African Americans only?
It's not.
If
We're
it's
arguing
not,
that
then
affirmative
how is it
action
a-
is intensely beneficial because
Okay, it might be
it's
beneficial.
to all minorities, because all
Okay.
minorities are subjugated, not just African Americans.
But you told me that it's not a reparation, correct? So how is it
I'm
a
sorry.
trade-off?
The Affordable Care Act was specifically targeted toward African Americans, and it doesn't matter
But it's
because
not-
people thought it was a reparation. It doesn't matter if it actually was. People thought it was.
Wait,
now I'm
so
asking you a question.
wait, hold on. Is it a reparation or not?
Okay, I don't think you understand.
No, I
Whether or not-
understand
whether or
that
not-
people might think it is, but then if it's not a reparation and like that knowledge is like spread out into like
Whether
the world,
or
then-
not you or I believe that it's a reparation, I don't believe it was a reparation. But that
Okay.
doesn't mean Tim Wise writes
Okay,
that the
let's
public
change
perception
up
of
the
it
question, right?
was that it was a reparation,
Okay.
and that led to like terrible
Hold
things.
on,
for
I don't think
African
you're getting this argument. Do people think that it's a reparation to African Americans only? That's my question.
Americans. Let's move on because
No, like this is really
we're
really
going in
important.
circles. Tim
No,
Wise
because
writes that it was. I don't know
he
what to
writes
tell
that
you.
it's a reparation, but does he write that it's a reparation
Yes,
to
yes, he
African
does.
Americans?
He writes that it was to African Americans.
Okay,
I don't
well-
know what to tell you.
We'll like to see
Of-
that later.
of
You
course.
can have a question.
Sure. So your entire thing about discourse, can you show that reparations actually lead to more discourse? You say that like at least like discourse is good, and like
Yeah.
maybe discourse is good, maybe discourse is bad. We say it's bad,
We'll
but
say it's
can
good.
you? Oh, well, great. We'll just say it's good. Can you outline how it like increases or decreases? Do you
Well,
show
yeah.
any of that?
Sure. Like the first thing we tell you is that Bird says 84% of the people don't believe that racism is a problem. When the government actually gives reparations, it's essentially admitting to the public that they have admitted
But
they have done a public
You don't
wrong,
actually
and that
show that. Like, of
No,
course you can
like-
assert that. Like,
no,
I can
like,
assert that
by
you know,
definition-
unicorns are real, but
No,
like,
but,
unless
like,
you have evidence.
the thing is, by definition, when we pass a reparation, we are saying that we have done it injustice and that we have to pay back
But
for
that
that.
doesn't affect discourse. Like, you don't
It
show
does
that.
because again, we tell you that they admit that they done something wrong.
Can we trade laptops back now?
Yeah.
And then just
Alright, let me just take one more.
before, I guess, before my speech, I'll take it to the press. Do you mind if I see?
Oh yeah, sure. So we'll use our method right now. Okay, I'll do it. Give them a few seconds. Are all 3 judges ready?
Yes.
Robert? And opponents. Go for it. Okay. Let's start with the framework that they set down in today's debate. They read you Eric Posner saying that reparation has to be backwards looking, but Alfred Brophy writes in a paper responding to Eric Posner writes that reparations are both backwards looking and forwards looking, in that yes, we are acknowledging that there were problems in the past, but we are linking those problems to the present. In the same sense that reparation would never just say slavery was bad. Everyone knows that. We're saying that slavery is responsible for current discrimination, and that link, when you make that, you generate unique discourse, because you acknowledge the problem, and that is the prerequisite to solving it. That is the crux of our case. The second major overview on their round is that we're looking at a moral obligation. That's what ought says. And when you look in the context of a reparative moral obligation, what we explain to you is that justice does not care what white people are going to think when reparations are paid, and they definitely don't care about potential losses of reform. We care about one thing and one thing only. Did we do something wrong? Then we pay them back. For that reason, you affirm on face you can sign your ballot pro. Let's go to their contention one, which deals with social movements. Their subpoint A says that currently there's criminal justice reform, and that's really, really good, and we have two responses to this. The first of which is that they don't prove that there's going to be a trade-off. Because logically speaking, if we already have bipartisan support for this reform, there's no reason that people in Congress are suddenly going to say the disparities in prisons just went away. We don't need to care about them anymore. That's logically inconsistent there. But second and more importantly, we tell you that there's an increase in reform because what happens is that minorities join into coalitions and push for more progressive reform when they see that the government is standing with their agenda. But this is not just me saying it, there's empirics for this as well. When Japanese Americans join coalitions like Robert told you, something actually happened. In 1990 and 1991, the US federal government passed the Civil Rights Acts of 90 and 91, which ended anti-Asian discrimination in the workplace and on the streets and military. For those reasons, we're giving you real-world empirics about after reparations we can see real political change. Now let's move to their subpoint B about why we make these coalitions worse, and we have a few responses to this. The first one they give you is that people are going to start denying racism. They actually give you an example how about in apartheid, 17% fewer people saw racism and this discrimination as a problem. We have a few responses. One is that the reason people are denying racism right now is a colorblind ideology. We essentially say that it's not a problem of race, but that all minorities should be treated the same. But what happens is that most sociologists explain that colorblindness leads to an ignorance of racial problems because people say there are no unique African American disparities, even when there are. What reparations do is that we acknowledge that we have to solve each specific injustice one step at a time instead of collectivizing them into one group, because then we can't solve for unique disparities. And that's how we make these social movements stronger, because organizations like Black Lives Matter right now, which are pushing for the reform they talk about, are literally saying there's an African American specific problem that we need to address. Reparations make it clear that the government will address those problems. Second, they tell you that with apartheid, we saw a decrease in support. The problem with this example is that in apartheid literally took control of the education system and changed it to whitewash history. It's a really bad example that they read you. You shouldn't consider this, especially when people aren't just going to start saying that slavery wasn't bad. That's completely illogical. Now let's move to their second warrant, where people essentially say that we've solved the problem and so they become complacent, and we have two responses to this. The first of which is, again, this didn't happen in the past. With Japanese Americans, we saw more reforms. But second and more importantly, what Lori Balfour says is that even if some people say racism is no longer an issue to deal with, the majority of people are going to understand that once they know the link between the past and the present, any future racial problems, they will not stop until we solve them, because they understand that they are still responsible for them. That means that in the long term, we're increasing political will to solve problems. You're turning this entire contention. Now let's move to their contention 2 on rollback, and they say that whites are going to be hostile. But according to Balfour again, she says the reason that whites are hostile right now is because they don't think that past injustices cause current problems. They think it's African Americans' fault. Paying reparations changes that because we say that is not true, and she says that public opinion would change. In fact, look to Sorolla, who says, on net we saw a decrease in racism after reparative measures were employed in the form of implicit biases. This not only turns contention 2, but also contention 3 about stereotypes against them. They give you a few examples. They say rolling back affirmative action, but first off, they don't tell you this has happened before, and second and more importantly, affirmative action is not a race-based policy, so if they're telling you that we're going to be rolling back race-neutral policies since it affects other minorities as well, by their logic, no kind of racial justice should always ever be pursued, because we always see a trade-off. Then they talk about how there's going to be welfare cuts and all these other harms, and also coming off of stereotypes. You can group them because their own author Brown says stereotypes are the root cause. What we're saying is that we break down stereotypes because essentially we say the reason African Americans poor are not because they're inferior, but because we put them there, and acknowledges the problem is a prerequisite to solving it, thus we affirm.
Okay. Do you mind if I take forward?
Right?
Yeah.
Cool.
That was 15 taken.
Yeah. And then 4 cripples which are released during our cross. Do you mind pulling up so that cripple can read Balfour?
Balfour? Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Here, super nice.
Oh yeah.
Okay. That was 10 more take or 15 more taken, so we have 25 taken plus our initial. What was that, like 15 or something?
What's that? Maybe.
Okay. Is everybody ready? First, they're trying to put this observation that they win if the U.S. federal government did harms to African Americans. We're not going to argue against that U.S. federal government did harms to African Americans. It's morally repugnant to argue against that, not to mention it's just a fact. It's not a debatable issue. The fact is, this debate is asking us whether or not we should advocate if reparations are good for African Americans or bad for African Americans. If we did a harm in the past, that's not a reason to vote pro. With that, there's a couple reasons. First, they're saying that we have a moral obligation. John Stuart Mills defines a moral obligation when it's a policy decision under a consequentialist framework. Essentially, the U.S. federal government has to weigh the benefits of reparations versus the harms of reparations in order to consider if it's a moral action. That's where we're going to be. It's immoral to harm African Americans just because we harmed them in the past. It's immoral to perpetrate those harms. With that, let's walk down their case. Their first contention is moral obligation. We agree with pretty much everything that they said. The U.S. federal government has harmed African Americans. Not to mention banks have harmed African Americans. Numerous other institutions have harmed African Americans. But the problem is, these institutions have also harmed other minorities. The fact is, under constitutionality, specifically strict scrutiny, the U.S. federal government cannot apply reparations to a problem that specifically affected one race if it actually had impacts that affected over multiple races. This is a problem for them because it's not actually legal for the United States to take the action of reparations that they are advocating for. There are 4 binds that we put on them. First is over-inclusive. Their policies, not only, like, the policies that they could advocate for, help more than just African Americans. That's why it's unconstitutional. The second is under-inclusive. The harms that they outline help only African Americans, or harmed more than African Americans, but the solutions only help African Americans. That's under-inclusive. The third is race-neutral policy. McCarran and Rossman write that if there's a race-neutral policy or a race-neutral alternative to the advocacies that they outline, then there is a grounding for constitutional rollback for their programs that re-return all the harms that we outline in case, but none of the benefits that they do. That's the third harm that you're putting on their case, the reason why you're not going to be enacting reparations. Then their second contention. This is really where they get their offense. They're talking about progress. A couple reasons why this is bad. First, acknowledgement of past harms works. We agree. But the fact is their evidence is specifically not about reparations. This causes them a unique harm. The thing about reparations is, as they cite in their first case, is its goal is to solve for these problems. That's a unique problem because acknowledgement of harms, while it might lead to better discourse, can happen in the status quo. But the unique attempt to solve for these harms makes people think that these harms are over because the government attempted to ameliorate the issues that were affecting African Americans. That's a problem because if reparations don't actually solve, they don't actually accomplish anything, but everybody believes that this happens anyway, right? The fact is that discourse is uniquely negative. Crahan specifically argues that discourse is uniquely negative for African American reparations, not to mention Tim White says that it leads to whites believing that racism is over. He says it leads to a post-racial liberalized era that leaves racism off the table but keeps racism in place. Racism exists, nobody talks about it anymore. The fact is right now, Black Lives Matter movements and other social programs are having discussions about race, but when you enact reparations, you kill those movements and you stop any discussion about race. Nobody cares about it, but it still exists. Then the second argument about minority coalitions. First off, a couple reasons. First, they're only talking about Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans were uniquely different than African Americans. The harm was very recent. We interned them. 6 months later, we gave them reparations. But the fact is, even after we gave that, it led to the least productive in Congress in history. Not to mention, affirmative action, which was seen as stealth reparations, led to the 2 least productive Congresses in history. The fact is, even if they want change, even if they lead to minority coalitions, they can't get this change because Congress won't do anything. Nothing happens because the government of the United States believes that racism is over. And lastly, they're talking about discourse. A couple reasons. First off, Allison Gold says that the government, no matter what they can do, cannot change people's minds. Not to mention, Heitzig argues that the inaction of reparations uniquely perpetuates the white power structure over anything else because it creates the dynamic that whites in the government are giving to African Americans because they need it more and they can't support themselves. That's why you're going to be negating on face, because the very nature of reparations doesn't solve for the harms, but uniquely creates bad discourse and bad impacts. And that's why we are proud to negate this resolution.
Are you ready for cross?
Yeah.
Okay, so you brought up.
Do you mind if we get the foul?
Oh, yeah, I did it.
Thanks.
Can I shoot the string cross?
Hmm?
Can I shoot the string cross?
Yeah, that's fine. So, go ahead.
Yeah.
You brought up how we've had like less productive Congress because of pseudo reparations like affirmative action and the Affordable Care Act, right?
Right.
So let's say I grant you that. Does that mean that the Affordable Care Act and affirmative action weren't worth it?
The point is,
No, were they worth it or not?
right, they were worth it because they were social programs.
But you said that they were seen as reparations in the same way that reparations would be.
No, that's different. They were seen as stealth reparations, which means the impact of that is less than what actual reparations would have.
So,
The thesis of our argument is that while those stopped reforms, reparations uniquely roll back.
okay, so here's what we're going to argue, right? You're saying that having a stealth reparation, which probably won't have as many benefits to African Americans as a reparation will have some kind of gridlock. Let's say we increase the benefit of that reparation, you'll also see a couple more harms. But like on the whole, doesn't it make sense that passing a policy for minorities will always have more benefits than whatever gets rolled back
I
afterwards?
completely agree. Passing a policy for minorities helps them.
Okay,
The fact
for
is,
African Americans.
passing a policy uniquely for one minority harms them because you're essentially taking all African Americans,
So
raising them up, and leaving every other minority to fall into the hole.
So let's
that
talk
you
about that
left
for just 1 second, because you bring up how under strict scrutiny, passing a race-based policy for the 3 reasons you give would be unconstitutional, right? What is the one exception to strict scrutiny?
I don't know.
Past governmental discrimination. Strict scrutiny says that if there is governmental discrimination against one race, then it would not be under or over-inclusive because that was the only race affected, and there's no race-neutral alternative to a race-based problem.
Of course there is a
Waterhouse,
race-neutral
constitutional scholars
alternative.
all agree.
The
U.S.
fact
v.
is-
Paradise set constitutional precedent for that.
First thing, there's a couple reasons. First off, the Federal Housing Administration, one of the harms that you outline in your very moral obligations to intention, specifically discriminated not just against African Americans, but many
Right.
other
One of the
races.
10 harms we listed was race
You
neutral.
listed
The other
them.
9 were race specific. We will just advocate for reparations for those 9. Are you happy? Do you have a question?
No. Okay, yeah, sure. So when you're talking about morality, if reparations hurt African Americans, should we do them?
Here's the difference, right? This is a backwards-looking obligation. We are saying that if I take $10 from you, it doesn't matter how you're going to spend the $10. You could buy a bomb. It doesn't matter. I still have an obligation to pay you
Right,
back.
so you're
That
saying you
makes
don't
logical
care
sense.
if reparations like re-entrench a cycle of racism
So-
or make African Americans think that they're worth less
So
than
here's
everybody
what I'm
else.
saying, right?
We should just do them.
Obviously, if you prove like a huge harm that would not be countered by any benefits, I'll give it to you. But if the judges have a trouble making a decision about whether the benefits will outweigh the harms, I would say the tiebreaker would at least be the moral obligation because it's what we
Why?
ought to do.
Why?
Why?
Remember,
If we can't decide
governmental
whether it's good or
institutions
bad, we
advocate
should
for
say they're
ought
bad.
in a consequentialist
No.
reason,
Again,
right?
if
We
the
don't
judges
weigh
cannot
things
decide
morally.
like a pro or con at the end of the round, the tiebreaker should not be an obligation. Should we not do what is morally right when the consequences
The
aren't
fact is,
necessarily
it's
true or right?
immoral to just hurt African Americans. If you don't do anything, vote neg on face
If
because
reparations lead to like
lead to
re-enslavement or
possible
really,
harm.
really big harms, fine, they can vote
If
for you.
reparations on net harm anybody more than they help, then you vote neg.
Okay, can I have a question?
Go ahead.
Okay, so you talk about how we're re-entrenching this white dynamic by essentially saying that you need a government handout to succeed, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that seen with every other policy because we're basically giving handouts to minorities?
No, because reparations uniquely say we recognize that you were not able to succeed without.
Here's the
this.
difference though, right? Instead of saying here's a handout, we're saying here's a repayment for a wrong. It is not
I
a
know.
handout, you are not
It
inferior.
doesn't
Instead,
matter.
You were
It
wrong.
doesn't matter
We're going
what
to change
you're
that.
advocating for. The way reparations are seen uniquely creates.
We read
this, and that's what
psychological
makes
studies
it
would say you're
arguments.
wrong.
I know you take like some if you have 50 seconds.
Yeah.
Can we have the Balfour evidence back now?
I'm gonna read in my speech, but you can have it back.
Yeah, because I would use it to help Robert Peppers. Sorry.
Cool. Yeah, there's like 6 or 7 left.
And you guys can just take it back.
Thanks.
Everyone ready? So a quick off-time roadmap. The order is just going to be like a quick overview on the entire debate, the arguments that they go for, and then our voters. So with that being said,
Time begins now.
So in the end, remember that even though reparations are this hypothetical situation, if you don't know what exactly is going to happen in the future, the tiebreaker of this round is going to be a moral obligation. Because if we harmed African Americans in the past, we basically have an obligation to help them in the future. That's why you pay reparations. But even then, we do guarantee you that there is going to be discourse, and people will acknowledge that discrimination right now is a problem. With that being said, go on to their case, there's a few main responses. First of all, remember that coalitions in the past have been affected. Right after we paid reparations to Japanese Americans, they joined the NAACP. There was actually effective civil rights movements of 1990 and 1991. Those are empirical examples of rights being passed right after reparations. They never talk about that. But second of all, they're basically saying that after apartheid, these people never deserve reparations. That's like logically flawed. You shouldn't buy you shouldn't buy apartheid after that. But furthermore, remember, the most important evidence we bring up comes from Sorolla. He says that once we give reparations through a psychological study, people are going to be changing their mindset. They're not going to think that like they're going to actually acknowledge the problem. They want to solve the problem in the future because they realize that discrimination is happening right now and they need to change that. With that being said, go on to our side. There's a few major reasons why vote for us. First, on moral obligation, they tell you like there's strict scrutiny and we can't pass like reparations legally. But remember, Devesh tells you in Cross-Ex that the one exception to strict scrutiny is that if there's past governmental discrimination, which is exactly what's happening right now. But even if you don't buy that, we're just going to give reparations to African Americans because we harmed African Americans through slavery and through Jim Crow and through past discrimination. With that being said, remember, we do have a moral obligation to pass reparations because we've harmed them in the past. Don't let them extend any more reputations. That's going to be the first reason why vote for us. But then go on to progress. Go on to acknowledgement. Remember, they tell you that the goal is to like solve this problem. The goal of reparations is not to solve the problem. Balfour tells you that reparations are going to be forward-looking and backwards-looking. That means that we acknowledge the past discrimination, but we also say that we need to solve the future discrimination. We're going to start with the reparations. We're going to have even more reforms down the road. That's going to be extremely important because then Chen tells you that we're going to have 3 times more policy in the future if we have reparations. There's going to be an increase in political will. And remember, Sophia Chen, remember Spears tells you we're going to be seeing efficacy of coalitions by 34%.
Cool. Okay, that's 48 taken, plus our 25. Oh boy. Shock it up to like, what's that?
60, 47?
Math is not a strong suit. Let's move past this. Okay. I'll be just off-time roadmap. We're still on this? We're still on this?
Sorry.
Okay. Brief off-time roadmap. I'm going to be explaining why everything you just said was wrong, and then go to reasons. Go for it. The only offense, the only reason to vote pro that they just brought up was productive discourse. Reparations inside this productive discourse. I'm going to be explaining why this is completely wrong. First, their own Balfour card specifically writes that the #1 risk of reparations is forestalling any thoroughgoing attempt to consider what needs to be done to affect racial justice. It says the next line. Unfortunately, I guess they just didn't read the next line of their card because it says that it will actually decrease the government's ability and motivation to fight racism. This is key because when we pass reparations, it makes it impossible for the government to ever see that this racism is done because they think, hey, we've done racism, we've solved it, we're done. They don't have any reason to continue. Then read Gilliam in 2014 says that when we talk about reparations, it's actually a non-starter for discourse. It's actually worse when we have racial targeted policies. When we talk about affirmative action programs that just all minorities are hurt, this leads to better discourse because it means that there's more people identified as being subjugated, and we can bring them all up together instead of creating this weird dichotomy between African Americans now suddenly raised above all the other minorities that have been hurt. Then onto clear reasons to negate. they do not talk about stereotypes. This is the number one reason to negate, because Peffley and Hurwitz find that when we have a policy that's specifically targeted toward African Americans, it leads to it increases harm. It actually increases racism because people believe, oh my gosh, African Americans actually don't have the ability to help themselves. But when we talk about all minorities, when we talk about all people who are being hurt and are poor and have like terrible things happen to them, we can actually see positive change and less racism. This is important because at the end of the day, we're going to see that when we give reparations, not only does their own card agree that we lead to less effective implementation of policies that help African Americans in the long run, but these effective policies, such as affirmative action, lead to 60% of African Americans getting into some colleges, which basically when we roll back these policies, because the government says, hey, we're done, this means that 60% of African Americans now get cut from college.
Do you have a laptop back?
Yep.
Where was the thing that you put? Oh, okay, I see it. You highlighted it. Cool. Yeah. So, are you guys ready?
Yep.
Okay. So, quick clarification, right? You said that the next sentence says before stop progress, right? Sure. It's not the next sentence, right? It's 3 sentences before, and then she says why that argument is wrong, and it gives a bunch of reasons because she concludes pro.
Actually, the big bolded part, I read the next
No,
one.
that's not what we cited though. There's a different bolded part right
So
here.
the big
where it
bolded
says why
part
it's
wasn't
true.
what you read.
Oh my.
No, like, I can just quote it, right? This
I
is
guess
what
I
we
read the
quoted.
wrong part.
This
The
is
big
what we
bolded
quoted in
one.
our case, right? Insofar as it fosters an enlarged historical consciousness, reparations would generate the kind of political will necessary to attack racial injustice.
Keep going. Keep going.
Without the prior development of such consciousness, Americans currently do not support reparations, but some forms of reparations that aim to close the book on American racial history rather than opening to scrutiny and revision.
Closing the book on racial history. They think that we're
That's
over.
the kind of
No, we're
reparations
saying
that America
like
supports.
there was a past injustice. We want to repair that injustice so we can help
Right.
African Americans.
We
in the
want to
future.
close the book on
Wait,
racial
what you
history.
saying
No,
is
we're
that
not
at worst,
closing the book.
at
We're
worst,
closing
like-
the book, and that
Okay,
is
like,
very
really quickly,
specific.
Just,
Guys,
it's a wash. She
Can we
says like
clear this
literally
up
she just
really
contradicts
quickly,
herself.
right? Can we just talk about the warrant really quickly?
Sure.
Okay, if we say all the problems that affect African Americans are caused by class discrimination, which is logically true because African Americans are inherently inferior,
Right.
then when we pay reparations and it doesn't fully solve the problem, what our logic is that when we see future disparities, we say we do not stop until we address them because we understand that the responsibility is still
Well,
there.
okay, so couple things. First off, nowhere in your case do you outline how reparations do anything to solve the problem. The only thing that
No, we're saying reparations are designed to solve racism. They're designed to create a starter for
But
solving it going
nothing
forward.
in your case says how reparations actually solve
Actually, we talk about
institutional-
acknowledgement, and then we talk about coalitions, and
Right.
then we talk about discourse.
That is
All
our
three
entire
points
case.
tell you why they
You don't respond to the part that I read
Alright,
that says
so
the justifications
Let's
of
break it down
racism.
really
No,
simply,
like,
right?
we- I-
Use one
I-
example of reparations right up in the round. Not pseudo-reparations, but reparations that actually acknowledge the injustice. What happened 2 years after? I mean, we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which for
Okay.
10 years
Big
were
fat
unable to be passed,
correlation.
and finally they did, and they
It's-
ended anti-Asian
I
discrimination.
ate
in the
an
workplace.
apple the other day and there was a hurricane
No,
in the
no, no.
Philippines. It's a
Yamamoto,
big fat
an author that
correlation. It doesn't create any causality.
really quickly. Yamamoto, the author that you cite in your case, says that it was because of reparations. He
No,
literally
he
says the Asian groups that joined the NAACP
No.
said they
I
did it because
I
they
would
believed
love
the
to
government
see
would
that.
stand for them
I would
after
love to see where he
reparations.
says it's because of that. Because
And
I know how
also-
Yamamoto
yeah,
writes. He
okay,
says this happened, this happened, this
No,
happened. Right? He doesn't
Yamamoto's
write
like,
causality.
what you're trying to tell us is
the
that if-
public perception of reparations
I
led to
believe
this.
this is getting into one hot mess.
Yeah.
Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Sure.
Do you guys have a question?
But yeah, so do reparations, or at least the sociology study that you're talking about, the Balfour Card, does it specifically say about like the government giving reparations?
She's talking about reparations.
Right,
In
but she's
general.
talking about like the government giving reparations, because like banks
what
can
else?
give reparations.
Wait, that doesn't matter. We're just saying this is one kind of reparations.
Actually,
No, it's a crucial point, right? Because Gilliam is specifically talking about when governments frame issues in historical context specifically.
The
about
Gilliam
reparations.
average that you just put up has nothing to do with government.
Oh, it
I read
absolutely
the
does.
whole study.
Okay,
It talks about
Allison
Not to
people
mention
talking
Alison
about
Gold that I
past.
read in rebuttal says that governmental institutions framing things in historical lights don't foster any discourse that is
Unless they
positive.
acknowledge the problem, which is
Nope,
what the
that's not
psychological
what
study
Gold
usually
says.
says.
That's
Look, it's an evidence back and forth, but we're winning the wars.
Would you like to take your 6 seconds?
That's fine. Okay. All 3 judges ready?
Yes.
Opponents. Let's tie up some loose ends in this thing. Let's start with the stereotype argument that they continue to extend into the summary. They say that we create the stereotype that blacks are inferior. The argument that we're making is that we uniquely break down those stereotypes because that's the kind of perception right now. What people say is that African Americans are poor because they're lazy, because they cause crime, and not because of discrimination. When we pay reparations, we do two things. One, we say it's not racial preference so much as racial restitution. We're not victimizing them, we're just paying them back for a wrong, which breaks down the stereotypes that are currently caused by policies like affirmative action and welfare. That's what they don't respond to. And second, and more importantly, we tell you that we break down the current stereotypes that exist because we're saying that the reason they're poor isn't because they're inferior, rather it's because we put them there. And that's why we A, generate the political will to solve problems going forward, but B, break down the stereotypes. Now I know they're going to bring up a lot of evidence, but the one evidence that you should call for after this round is the Sorolla psychological study. It's specific to reparations and says that acknowledging injustice decreases implicit biases even after we say we've repaired the injustice. At that point, we are breaking down the stereotypes. We are turning their main argument. For that reason, look to the reason you vote for us, and that is acknowledging the injustice. We tell you there are a lot of benefits from coming here. First, is that even if we claim that we've solved it, what we're also saying is that reparations and the past injustices are a result for all problems, which means that if we don't solve all the problems with one reparation, we'll have future policies to solve them going forward. That's why Chen tells you that we mobilize people around the civil rights agenda, leading to 3 times more policy to stop discrimination. The empirics are here as well. We tell you with Japanese Americans, we saw the Civil Rights Act of 1990 and 1991 because of reparations that weren't able to be passed for decades before, and finally they were. At that point, we're telling you that complacency just didn't happen, and the empirics and warrants they're giving you aren't specific to acknowledging the injustice. In fact, the pseudo-reparations like Obamacare and affirmative action were pseudo-reparations because they didn't literally say that slavery and Jim Crow were what caused the healthcare disparities. They just said, let's solve the problem. We have to acknowledge it if we're going to have effective solutions, which is why we get our impacts. Then let's talk about discourse and coalitions again. What we're saying is that even if some people don't change their views, the people who are on the fence about understanding racism right now are the ones that move to the left, and that in turn decreases racism on the whole, again, per the psychological study. At the end of the day, we're winning the warrants, we're winning the empirics, we're winning the studies. We are very proud to affirm.
We'll take the remainder, 48 seconds or whatever we agreed on. Actually, we have 22 seconds left. Can I just read through all?
Yeah, sure. One second, let me just search it.
Of course. No, totally.
Reparations increase positive and reduce negative reactions. And It's a psychological study.
Okay. Okay. Yep.
Is everybody ready? Yep. I'm just going to be clarifying the debate and giving you reasons why we win. There are a couple of reasons why you're voting con on this resolution. The first, Devesh comes up here, talks really pretty about how he's solving and they're solving for stereotype type. The fact is, they don't really respond to this round. All Devesh does is just assert that he's solving. He doesn't tell you why. Right? He just says that maybe reparations break down the underlying racial barriers. He doesn't assert any piece of evidence. He just asserts this fact and then just leaves it at that. The fact is, they don't respond to how when you enact reparations uniquely through the U.S. federal government, which is what our evidence entails to, you actually accrue certain harms to African Americans, and not just African Americans, all other minorities. That's why you're voting neg, because the enaction of reparations through the U.S. federal government hurts them, right? The fact is, all their evidence, and the only piece of evidence they have, the Sorolla study, is a the social study is specifically talking about just reparations. Remember, Allison Gold says that uniquely when you enact reparations through the U.S. federal government, it is not only a non-starter for discussion, it changes nobody's opinion and only re-entrenches this. Tim Weiss quantifies this when he specifically talks about how enacting reparations through the U.S. federal government leads to a post-racial era where it leaves racism off the table but leaves racism in place. Racism still exists, but nobody cares about it anymore because the goal of reparations is to solve, right? The fact is, the acknowledgement that they bring up, the only offense that he goes for, doesn't actually give him any offense because he doesn't tell you why reparations are the only way to acknowledge these harms. There's no reason why it has to be reparations. There's no reason why it has to be from the U.S. federal government. That's why you're going to be voting nay. Then, remember, my partner says Gilliam. Gilliam specifically argues in 2014 that by enacting reparations, it leads to a non-starter for discussion. By framing things in a historical light, it is a non-starter. That's a huge impact because in that regard, you're never going to see any future policy because reparations by nature stop future reforms. The fact is, Japanese Americans are not a good example to look to. This nature was structurally different. We gave them reparations 6 months after we interned them, not hundreds of years after we enslaved them. They're structurally different. They don't have the evidence in today's round, nor do they have the logical reasoning as to why we need to give reparations from the U.S. federal government, and that's why you're going to be voting neg, because they don't have uniqueness and they don't have offense, and the only thing reparations do is accrue harms.